course, um, okay, I'm going to talk today with a focus on the nonprofit sector. And of course, within the nonprofit sector, we have settlement service organizations. And of course, they've all played a very key role in providing supports during the pandemic. And nonprofits are also, of course, a very key set of institutions closely linked to social resilience. And of course, all these organizations are also very close to the communities that they serve. I'm not going to provide a definition of social resilience because Valerie's going to give part of the one of the talks a little bit later, and she's going to talk about that in a much fuller way. Now, a lot of this material is in fact drawn. Oops, I need to switch my slide here. Sorry. Drawn from a report that was done by myself and Zainab Abu Al-Rab, who does send her regrets. She wasn't able to be with us today because of a work commitment. And it's on the BMRC website called COVID-19 Migration in the Canadian Immigration System. And in that, you can turn to that and you'll find a lot of the material and references and so forth. I also should, I guess, apologize in advance for the lack of graphics and illustrations in my slides, and they're very densely worded. So I do apologize for that dense wording of these slides. Let me first of all set the context, and I want to sort of position the nonprofit sector before I go on to talk more specifically about the settlement sector. And of course, the nonprofit sector has come to be a key service delivery vehicle for government programs since at least the 1980s and into the 1980s, very much governed by new public management. And the idea here is that government is meant to steer and nonprofits are meant to row. And it's a case of kind of operational partnerships with contracted services. So not true partnerships where there's real sharing. It's more of an operational type of relationship. The nonprofit sector also supplements social protection in Canada's very lean welfare state model, acting as social shock absorbers, filling gaps left, in fact, by a shrinking state. And this is especially the case during crises where their services are increasingly and more fully kind of called upon and needed. And the case of food banks with the idea of food insecurity is a good example here. And of course, the official safety net is quite inadequate to deal with those food security needs, and hence the nonprofit sector steps in. Now, of course, there's a lot of value of the nonprofit sector in terms of its community-focused type of delivery, the fact it comes in multiple shapes and sizes and diversity that can service groups that are harder for government to reach and in more tailored and less bureaucratic kinds of ways. And of course, these are also organizations that provide a voice role for the populations that it serves. Also, these are mission-based organizations with workers deeply committed to nonprofit goals, which is a real valuable asset in terms of their commitment under stressful circumstances, quite often to serve the populations that they represent. And the reality is that the nonprofit sector, especially under new public management, has largely been used by the state as a cheap service delivery agent, not as I said before, as a true partnership. Nonprofit service providers are actually featured by the fact that they're lean operations. And they've been engaged in for years in doing more with less. In fact, they've been working under a situation of permanent austerity. And so there's kind of a duality within the nonprofit sector. On the one hand, they're considered very resilient organizations and innovative organizations. In fact, the term the resilient sector and the innovation sector is often used for them. But at the same time, they're also very precarious organizations. And it's also been called the precarious sector as a consequence. And that sort of precariousness limits the sector's own resilience and their force as a source of social resilience. For example, the workforce in the nonprofit sector is really featured by permanent temporariness, because it's even for full-time workers, they're dependent upon the next short-term contract. And I did pull a quote from another study that I think captures this, by a senior nonprofit sector manager, who said it's a precarious sector. We're really in danger of becoming cheap government services with all the accountability of government, and I would add here in far more, and none of its infrastructure and stability. So underfunding of the operational costs and infrastructure of nonprofits has been a persistent problem. And I think one of the examples here that we saw during the pandemic, of course, was the reality of a technological gap within the sector, which really did hinder, because they weren't able to fully invest in their technology, which hindered many nonprofit organizations in their ability to shift online, as we saw during the pandemic. I think the other thing that's kind of interesting to note is that the Canadian Senate, which recently in 2019 had a parliamentary study and report, talked about a slowly intensifying crisis of the nonprofit sector. Much is expected of the nonprofit sector, but it's continuously underinvested in. And so the whole issue of capacity of the sector becomes a major issue. Now, what about then the COVID-19 pandemic and the nonprofit sector? Excuse me. Well, I would point first to the 2008 Great Recession. And it resulted in a real kind of culling of the nonprofit sector, especially for smaller organizations who many went out of business. And it shows that the sector is actually quite vulnerable to various economic crises. And of course, COVID-19 has been an even greater disruptor, as well, of course, as a revealer of the weaknesses within the structures of the nonprofit system, especially the service-oriented nonprofits. The pandemic heavily impacted the sector in Canada. In fact, Imagine Canada, during the survey early on in the first wave, revealed that 63% of social service organizations reported decreases in revenues, and 37% actually had layoffs of staff, with widespread threat of organizational closure. There was a large loss of workers in the sector, and particularly but not only of volunteers, who comprise, for some organizations, the bulk of their workforce. In fact, the pandemic opened up a triple threat to the nonprofit sector. One was the idea of revenue loss. Secondly, the problem of office closures and service cancellations, and then various human resource types of challenges. Now, the Ontario Nonprofit Network, the ONN, noted that nearly half of organizations did not even have 3 months of financial buffer. And so these were very thinly resourced organizations that were dependent upon just-in-time capacities. And this really put into jeopardy a large number of nonprofit organizations within the sector. For the nonprofit sector as a whole, there was increased demand, but diminished capacity within the sector. And remember, this is a very precarious sector. Plus, there's also the issue of a significant pent-up demand in a post-pandemic period that will create further stress within the sector as things begin to return to normal, or at least more of a normal situation. The weaknesses of the nonprofit sector in filling gaps opened by the pandemic demonstrated the need for widespread substantive government intervention. And I guess I would note here in particular, so the state had to be brought back in, and was in fact brought back in in Canada and elsewhere. And this ran very much counter to the austerity and neoliberal narratives and policies that had prevailed for decades beforehand. And in fact, it opened up a policy window that challenged sort of neoliberal policy and governance, and with a Build Back Better type of alternative agenda. So how did the nonprofit settlement sector fare in all of this? And before I get into that in more detail, I should note that the nonprofit settlement sector architecture is actually composed of three elements with varying pandemic impacts. There's the formal settlement set of organizations. I'm not sure formal is the exactly right word here for that, but anyways, this is what I'm going to come and focus upon next. But there's also sort of smaller and more informal organizations, largely many of them sort of very much voluntary based. There's lots of, and many of these are ethno-specific kinds of organizations. Many of these are, from anecdotal evidence, were under tremendous stress, and many, in fact, seem to have shuttered, at least for periods of time. Also, there's the more general community-based nonprofits who also support many immigrants. And I mentioned before the example of food banks. And again, many of those were very much under stress. Now, in terms of the more formal immigrant settlement organizations, and in a place like Ontario, that would be supported by IRCC funding, while structurally facing many of the same challenges of the nonprofit sector as a whole, we're in fact in a better position due to cross-institutional support by government for their operations during the pandemic. IRCC and other government bodies provided critical funding stabilization during the pandemic and continued to fund at full funding levels and with greatly relaxed expectations regarding the meeting of targets. IRCC supports, of course, settlement and has done so for a long period of time. There's over $1.2 billion in a year that go into settlement funding by RCC. The commitment to settlement services is, in fact, I would call it an unacknowledged part of the broader Canadian welfare state. And of course, there's a long-term commitment to state funding, but community-delivered settlement supports the so-called Canadian model of settlement funding. And this was an effort to combine the strength of government funding with the advantages of nonprofit delivery, although that model has been weakened by the impacts, as I've mentioned before, more generally with the nonprofit sector of the such things as new public management. Now, during the pandemic, IRCC did rise to the occasion. It was placed in on an open for business footing. It shifted online with only 2% of its staff in office, but with a pace of work intensification. In fact, one of the impressive things that happened during the first wave of the pandemic is that they were able to sign $4 billion in 5-year settlement agreements with organizations within the sector. And that sent, an important signal to those organizations, but also a substantive funding investment. And that was a major effort to do while being online and dealing with the pandemic. IRCC also engaged in increased and regular communication with agencies, which was important for building needed trust and cooperation between agencies and funders during the crisis. And I think it also helped to moderate the impact of highly competitive funding structures that can sometimes be a bit dysfunctional within the sector. IRCC additionally provided funding aid into such things as technical and digital upgrades for agencies and immigrant clients. So some very strategic investments. Now, overall, levels of partnering and cooperation in the settlement sector was encouraged by funders and by others, and it certainly has increased in the sector from all the evidence that we can see. There is strong building of relationships within the sector, especially with areas like the health sector. Perhaps somewhat more limited in terms of the relationship enhancement between settlement agencies themselves due to lingering effects of competitive funding models. And this we need to explore more. That seems to be more uneven on this scale. Now, the evidence from various surveys of the settlement sector, including that of Okazi, has been of the ability of the sector to successfully adjust operations and to shape shift into online service delivery with the continuation of some front-facing service delivery for the most vulnerable, in particular refugee immigrants, also supported by IRCC. Now, Okazi did indicate in its own first wave survey that there were some funding cuts and some layoffs here, because not all of the government, not all of the funding of the sector is government, but this was much milder than the nonprofit sector as a whole. Now, the shift to online services has generally gone smoothly, it would seem, from all the evidence that we have. For those immigrants with digital skills, good access to technology, strong English and French language skills. And in fact, it has increased the accessibility for some. For example, for women with children, it's enabled many of them to actually access services that they would have difficulty if it was in person. However, of course, some newcomers have fallen through the settlement service pandemic cracks, and that remains, an issue. So not everybody was affected in the same way. But the settlement sector, of course, remains under stress with many challenges for settlement workers, including working from home, the challenges, the issues of burnout, health and safety concerns, especially when they return to work, all as well as mental health issues. Now, a saying in the settlement sector during the pandemic is that it's not business as usual, it's more business than usual. And overall, what has been key is the essential role of government funding support for the settlement sector during COVID. It has allowed these organizations to adapt and build social resilience for immigrant communities. Immigrants have also been resilient themselves. This is a resilient population. But the pandemic revealed that for many, their lived experience was of extreme vulnerability. And I know Valerie's going to talk about some of these aspects in much more detail later. And the settlement agencies have certainly been of significant assistance in boosting their resilience capabilities. What about the future of the settlement sector? Well, clearly, the future is one with a digital face that will expand. Having said that, however, the public-facing side of the nonprofit sector remains essential. They need to be connected physically and embedded within those communities that they serve. There certainly is as the lessons have been learned from the pandemic, a number of service advantages and enhancements with this digital face. There is concern, however, that government funders will revert back to past competitive and more rigid funding practices, and that a period of funding restraint may be imposed to deal with deficits. So one of the big questions is, will government funders learn from the pandemic experience or return back to so-called normal practices? With the new digital capacities of the settlement sector that allow them to reach beyond their traditional service boundaries, will that increase agency competition going into the future? Now that agencies really can serve with this digital face clients anywhere. That could really create a lot of increased competition between organizations, which could have detrimental sides to them. The lessons and best practices from the COVID-19 experience need to be documented and acted upon. This needs to be done in a way where they're sharing without fear of excessive competition. So this needs to be a cooperative approach. We need to promote a cooperative agenda with respect to this. The other thing, there we go. The other thing is the importance of advocacy, the importance of the voice role of settlement organizations and their umbrella organizations in the post-COVID-19 period, because many revealed inequalities that were emphasized during the pandemic. And so that voice role of these organizations and an active role for that is very important. Sorry about my dog here. There's somebody at our door. It's also important to remember that advocacy, Gherkin, stop. Sorry.
John, we'll just do a time check. We're coming to the end of the time, just to give you a
okay, I've just got about 2 more minutes to go.
Great, perfect, thank you.
It's also important to remember that advocacy is good service because it helps to align community needs to public policy and programming. Immigration is also a central component of the post-pandemic recovery. And that very much, I think, is reassuring to the sector. The continued importance of immigration levels is really important because the funding base for the sector is very much determined by this. And the new numbers have come out, and they're again have been increased, and they're very strong. And so this is a very good sign for the sector. But of course, still with that, there's a need to broaden the immigration, migrant access to services. Temporary foreign workers, international students are still excluded. So what are some of the takeaways? And very quickly, innovation and resilience of the settlement sector, I think, has been demonstrated during the pandemic, and it's important for fostering social resilience. Secondly, the growing importance of technology, the digital turn, as the sector shifts in the future. And for that, we're going to need technology investments and supports. Thirdly, the need for investments to strengthen the overall capacity of the settlement sector organizations. And so we need to address the lack of overhead funding, the funding shortfall here from government and other funders. Fourth, stable government funding of the sector. And I think funding reform is central to the viability of the sector in the longer term. Fifth is the need to learn and act on the lessons from the pandemic. And sixth, and finally, to reject a return to austerity and adopt progressive, build back better agenda. And let me end on that. Thank you.